"Shut it down," the young woman said quietly. "If you start that engine again, you may not have an engine left to fix." For half a second, nobody moved. Then Richard Hale laughed. The sound cut through the Hale Performance Motors testing facility, where 20 engineers had spent 6 hours fighting a machine worth $12 million. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. Now, back to Emily Carter. Only minutes earlier, Richard had been staring through the reinforced glass at the HMX-9, the prototype meant to secure the largest contract in his company's history. Instead, it sat silent beneath fluorescent lights. Its polished metal casing still radiated heat. Diagnostic monitors glowed red. The smell of oil and hot machinery hung in the air. Again, Richard ordered. Marcus Reed, the chief engineer, hesitated. "Richard, we've already attempted 3 restarts. And I'm telling you to try a 4th. Richard Hale had built his reputation on refusing to accept failure. At 52, with silver beginning to show at his temples and a tailored charcoal suit separating him visually from everyone wearing shop clothes, he looked more comfortable in a boardroom than beside an engine. But today the boardroom was coming to him. In less than 3 hours, executives and potential clients would arrive to watch the HMX-9 demonstration. And the engine would not start. Marcus signaled the technician. The starter engaged. A metallic whine filled the chamber. Emily Carter's head lifted instantly. She had been standing near the rear workstation, almost invisible among engineers twice her age. At 25, she wore faded jeans beneath a plain navy work jacket. Her blonde hair was tied into a loose ponytail. No expensive watch. No impressive title printed across her jacket. Nothing that Richard considered important. The engine turned again. Emily's expression changed. "Stop." Nobody heard her. A sharp vibration traveled through the mounting frame. Emily stepped forward. "Turn it off." Marcus glanced toward her. Richard did too. "If you start it again," Emily said, her eyes fixed on the engine, "you're going to damage it." The starter died. Silence rushed into the facility. Richard slowly turned toward her. "And you are?" "Emily Carter." "I meant your position." A few engineers lowered their eyes. Emily hesitated. "I assist the diagnostic team." Richard looked at Marcus, then back at the young woman. 6 hours without sleep had stripped the patience from his voice. "So 20 engineers can't identify the problem, but you can." "I didn't say that. You just told me not to start my own engine." "I heard something." That earned a few quiet smiles. Richard noticed them. "What did you hear, Miss Carter?" Emily looked through the glass. "A secondary vibration just before shutdown." Marcus frowned. Richard folded his arms. "And from that, you've diagnosed a $12 million prototype?" "No." Emily's eyes remained steady. "But everyone is looking at why it won't start." She pointed toward the engine. "I think you should be asking why it doesn't want to." The smiles disappeared. Richard stared at her for a moment, then picked up a wrench from the workbench. He held it toward Emily. "You think you understand my engine better than the people who built it?" Emily looked at the wrench. Then at him. Richard smiled. "Fix it." Several heads turned. Emily did not reach for the tool. Richard thought he had just put an overconfident young assistant back in her place. He had no idea he had just challenged the one person in that building who recognized the sound the HMX-9 was making. And soon, everyone in that room would understand why. 3 weeks before Richard Hale placed that wrench in her path, Emily Carter had entered Hale Performance Motors through a side door reserved for technicians, carrying nothing but a canvas bag and a paper cup of coffee. Almost nobody remembered seeing her arrive. That suited Emily perfectly. At 25, she had learned that quiet people were often mistaken for people with nothing to say. Her faded jeans, inexpensive sneakers, and plain navy jacket only strengthened that assumption. While senior engineers crossed the facility discussing horsepower figures and performance targets, Emily moved between diagnostic stations without drawing attention. She listened more than she spoke. And she noticed everything. On her fourth morning, Ethan Miller, a young technician barely older than Emily, was struggling to reinstall a mounting assembly. "Something's wrong," he muttered. Emily stopped beside him. "What torque are you using?" 86. Her eyes moved to the specification sheet. "Where did you get that?" Ethan pointed. Emily studied the page for several seconds. "That revision is old." He frowned. "It's the sheet they gave me." Emily reached for a newer binder and flipped through it. 78. Ethan stared at her. "You memorized that?" "No." A faint smile touched her face. "I remembered seeing the correction." She walked away before he could ask another question. Later that week, Ethan found her standing alone before a diagnostic monitor, staring at a vibration graph from an earlier HMX-9 test. "You like that engine, don't you?" Emily glanced over. "It's interesting. That thing is Richard Hale's obsession." "So I've heard." Ethan lowered his voice. $12 million of obsession. Emily smiled, but her attention returned to the graph. Something about the waveform bothered her. Not enough to call it a failure. Not yet. She enlarged one section. Then another. A tiny irregularity appeared between two otherwise clean patterns. Marcus Reed entered behind them. "Problem?" Emily immediately stepped away. "No." Marcus looked at the screen. "You changed the scale." "I wanted to see the secondary vibration." Marcus studied her for a moment. "Why?" Emily hesitated. "Does the HMX-9 use active compensation under thermal load?" Marcus's expression shifted. It was a small change, but Emily saw it. "That's a strangely specific question for a diagnostic assistant." "I was curious." Marcus looked at her another second before closing the graph. "Curiosity is useful around here. Just be careful where you aim it." Emily understood what he meant. Hale Performance Motors had an invisible hierarchy. Engineers with prestigious degrees spoke first. Department heads spoke louder. Executives were rarely questioned. And Richard Hale was questioned by almost no one. So Emily returned to being invisible. She helped Ethan correct reports. She quietly caught a mislabeled pressure reading before it reached Marcus. Once, she spent her lunch break studying archived HMX-9 test logs while everyone else ate downstairs. Nobody asked why. Nobody noticed that she always searched the same narrow range of data. Nobody saw her notebook filling with small equations and hand-drawn vibration curves. And nobody knew why, during her first encounter with the HMX-9 itself, Emily had placed her hand against its cold metal housing and remained there for several seconds. Ethan had laughed. "Meeting the celebrity?" Emily withdrew her hand. "Something like that." Then she asked him one question. "Has anyone tested what happens when the compensation system receives two correct signals that disagree with each other?" Ethan blinked. "I have absolutely no idea what that means." Emily gave him a quiet smile. "Hopefully, neither does the engine." 3 weeks later, Standing before Richard Hale with 20 engineers watching, Emily would hear that same hidden disagreement. Only this time, the engine was no longer whispering. It was warning them. The wrench remained suspended between them. Richard Hale held it by the polished handle, waiting for Emily Carter to take it. Around them, 20 engineers stood beneath the cold fluorescent lights, caught between discomfort and curiosity. Emily looked at the wrench. Then at Richard. "I never said I could fix it." Richard's smile sharpened. "No. You only stopped an entire test because you heard something my engineering team apparently couldn't." Marcus Reed stepped forward. "Richard, she may have heard a harmonic change. We should review the recording before." "I wasn't speaking to you, Marcus." The words landed hard. Richard turned back to Emily. 3 hours remained before executives arrived. $12 million sat useless behind reinforced glass. Fear was beginning to creep beneath his anger, and powerful men like Richard rarely admitted fear. They found someone smaller to carry it for them. "So?" he asked. Emily's eyes moved toward the HMX-9. "I'd need the last 6 test logs." A few engineers exchanged glances. Richard gave a short laugh. "You'd need the logs." "Yes." "What else?" "The thermal compensation data. Fuel correction history. Vibration records from the last 3 shutdowns." The laughter stopped. Marcus watched her carefully. Richard lowered the wrench slightly. "You've thought about this." "I've looked at the data." "You're a diagnostic assistant. That doesn't prevent me from reading." A technician near the back coughed to hide a laugh. Richard heard it. His face tightened. He stepped closer to Emily. "Let's be clear, Miss Carter. This engine was designed by people with advanced degrees from MIT, Stanford, and Caltech. Marcus has spent 27 years building performance systems. We have specialists here who have forgotten more about engines than most people will ever learn." Emily nodded. "I know. And you believe they missed something?" Emily paused. "I believe the engine is telling us they did." The room went silent. Richard stared at her. There was no arrogance in her voice. That irritated him more. He wanted nervousness. An apology. Some sign that she understood the distance between his position and hers. Instead, her eyes remained steady. Richard placed the wrench on the workbench with a metallic crack. "All right." Marcus turned toward him. "Richard." "No. She wants us to listen." Richard raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Let's listen." He gestured toward Emily like a presenter introducing entertainment. "Go ahead, Ms. Carter. Show 20 professional engineers what they failed to see." Emily felt every pair of eyes settle on her. Some were skeptical. Some embarrassed for her. Ethan Miller stood near the diagnostic station, watching with something different. Recognition. He remembered the corrected torque specification. The vibration graph. The strange question about 2 correct signals disagreeing. Emily walked toward the computer. Richard called after her. "Actually." She stopped. "If you're going to diagnose my $12 million engine, perhaps you should do it properly." He pointed through the glass. "Fix it." A hush fell. Emily turned. Richard expected her to retreat. Instead, she asked one question. "If I accept, will you let me do it my way?" His eyebrows rose. "Your way. No interruptions. No restarting the engine unless I authorize it. And I decide what gets opened." Marcus looked sharply at her. Richard smiled. He believed she had just made her humiliation easier. Absolutely. Emily removed her navy jacket and folded it carefully over a chair. Then she tied back a loose strand of blonde hair. When she looked up again, something in her expression had changed. The quiet assistant was gone. "Then give me the logs," she said. Ethan moved first. And for reasons Richard could not yet understand, Marcus Reed followed. Richard Hale should have stopped there. He should have let Emily examine the logs quietly, away from the growing circle of engineers. But humiliation had already become something more dangerous than anger. It had become a performance. "Lauren," Richard called. His executive assistant appeared near the glass doors. "Yes, sir. Tell the board members who arrived early that we've found someone who believes she can diagnose the HMX-9. Emily looked up from the monitor. Marcus Reed's jaw tightened. "That isn't necessary." Richard ignored him. "And asked the senior engineering team to come down." Lauren hesitated. "All of them?" "All of them." Within minutes, footsteps echoed along the corridor. Department heads entered first, followed by senior engineers and two executives who had been waiting upstairs. They gathered around the testing chamber, whispering as they noticed Emily sitting at the diagnostic station. She recognized some of their faces. Most did not recognize hers. Richard did nothing to correct that. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "apparently we've been approaching our problem incorrectly." Emily's fingers stopped over the keyboard. Richard gestured toward her. Ms. Carter believes she heard something our entire engineering division missed. A few eyebrows rose. One senior engineer glanced at Marcus. "Who is she?" "Diagnostic assistant," Richard answered before Emily could speak. The words produced exactly the reaction he wanted. A quiet murmur. Someone smiled. Emily felt heat touch her cheeks, but she returned her attention to the screen. Richard stepped closer. "Tell them what you heard." "A secondary vibration." "Where?" "Near the transition into shutdown." "Frequency?" "I don't know yet." Richard smiled. "So you stopped the test without knowing the frequency?" "I stopped it because the vibration changed after the control system increased compensation." One engineer folded his arms. "That could be resonance." "It could." "Sensor noise?" "Possibly." "Mounting instability?" Emily nodded. "Also possible." Richard spread his hands. "There we have it." A few people laughed. Emily said nothing. Marcus stepped between them. "She asked for time to diagnose it, Richard. Give her time." Richard looked toward the digital clock above the chamber. 10:47 a.m. Then an idea entered his mind. "Fine." He turned to Emily. 30 minutes. The room quieted. Marcus stared at him. "That's ridiculous. Our clients arrive this afternoon. If she's confident enough to interrupt testing, 30 minutes should be generous." Emily slowly stood. "And if I don't find it?" Richard adjusted his cuff. "You return to your assigned duties and stay out of engineering decisions." He paused deliberately. "Assuming you still have assigned duties after today." Ethan's face hardened. Even some of the senior engineers stopped smiling. This was no longer a joke. Emily understood exactly what Richard had done. He had turned a technical disagreement into a public test of whether she deserved to remain in the building. She looked at the clock. 10:48. 29 minutes. Okay. Marcus leaned toward her. "Emily, you don't have to do this." "Yes," she whispered. "I do." She sat down and opened the first vibration log. Richard remained behind her. 5 minutes passed. Emily touched nothing on the engine. 10 minutes. She requested another test record. 15. Still no wrench. Richard checked his watch dramatically. Half your time is gone. Emily did not answer. At 20 minutes, someone near the back whispered, "She's got nothing." Richard heard it. A satisfied smile appeared. Then Emily suddenly froze. Her eyes narrowed at two lines of data separated by less than 4/10 of a second. She enlarged the graph. Marcus leaned closer. "What is it?" Emily pointed at the first spike. "This. The shutdown." She shook her head. "No." Her finger moved to the second line. "This is the shutdown." Marcus stared at the screen. Emily's voice became almost a whisper. "The first signal isn't the engine failing." Richard's smile faded. Emily looked through the glass at the HMX-9. "It's the engine trying to save itself." Richard Hale stared at the graph as if refusing to understand it might make Emily wrong. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" Emily did not answer immediately. She enlarged the waveform until two colored lines stretched across the monitor. "The shutdown system is working." Marcus Reed leaned closer. "Then why are we losing ignition?" "Because something happens before the shutdown." Richard checked his watch. 7 minutes. Emily ignored him. She pulled up the thermal compensation history and placed it beside the vibration data. Ethan watched her eyes move rapidly between the screens. "Can you overlay those?" she asked. He nodded. Seconds later, another graph appeared. Emily pointed. "There." Marcus frowned. The two spikes almost touched. "Almost. 400 milliseconds," he murmured. 386, Emily corrected. Richard folded his arms. "And?" Emily stood. "I need access to the engine." Finally. Several engineers moved toward the tool cabinets, but Emily walked past them without taking a wrench. Richard laughed softly. "You spent 23 minutes studying graphs, and now you're going to listen to it again?" "No." She entered the test chamber. The HMX-9 sat beneath the white lights, silent and imposing. Emily placed her fingertips against the housing. She moved slowly along the assembly until she reached a narrow section near the thermal control manifold. Then she stopped. "Ethan, flashlight." He handed it to her. Emily crouched. No one spoke. Richard watched through the glass. 5 minutes remained. Emily examined a connector, then followed its wiring toward a sensor assembly. She never removed it. Instead, she stood and returned to the control room. "You're not fixing anything," Richard said. Emily looked at him. "Not yet." "Because you don't know what's wrong." "Because replacing parts before understanding the failure is how people create new failures." The words landed harder than she intended. Marcus lowered his eyes, hiding the beginning of a smile. Richard did not. 3 minutes. Emily opened the records from the previous shutdown. Then another. Then another. 3 failures. 3 different operating temperatures. 3 apparently unrelated compensation values. But the delay was almost identical. Emily wrote 3 numbers on a notepad. Her breathing slowed. The noise of the room seemed to disappear. Ethan leaned closer. "What are those?" "The delay between compensation and protection." Marcus looked at the numbers. His expression changed. "That's too consistent." "Yes. For a mechanical failure." Emily nodded. Richard stepped forward. 1 minute. Emily opened the fuel correction table. Her finger traced one column downward. Then stopped. She whispered something. Marcus barely heard her. What? Emily looked at him. They're both right. Who? The sensors. Marcus stared at her. Emily turned the monitor toward him. The thermal sensor is reporting correctly. The pressure sensor is reporting correctly. That's why diagnostics never flagged either one. Richard shook his head. If both sensors are correct, there is no sensor problem. Exactly. Emily stood. The clock showed 12 seconds remaining. Richard pointed toward it. Time. Emily closed the laptop. A few engineers exhaled. Richard's confidence returned. Well, Miss Carter. Emily walked toward the HMX-9 but stopped at the glass. You've been searching for a broken component. Richard gave a dismissive shrug. Because something is broken. No. Emily's eyes remained fixed on the engine. Two systems are giving the computer perfectly valid information. She turned toward Marcus. The problem is that under thermal load, those two truths become incompatible. Marcus went completely still. Richard's smile disappeared. Emily pointed toward the compensation manifold. The ECU tries to reconcile them. Fuel correction increases. Vibration follows. Then the protection system shuts everything down before the disagreement destroys the engine. Nobody moved. Richard finally spoke. You can prove that? Emily met his eyes. Yes. How? She reached for the wrench he had offered her earlier. This time, she took it. Now I fix it. Emily Carter carried the wrench into the test chamber, but the first thing she reached for was not a bolt. It was a marker. Richard Hale watched through the reinforced glass as she drew two small lines on the transparent diagnostic panel. Thermal input, Emily said, marking the first. Then another. Pressure input. Marcus Reed stood beside her. Both within tolerance. Exactly. Emily connected the lines. Individually. Richard's patience snapped. You said you could prove it. Emily turned toward him. I am. She pulled up the HMX-9 control sequence and highlighted a narrow section of code logic. When temperature rises, this system adjusts combustion parameters. At the same time, pressure feedback requests a separate correction. Marcus studied the screen. We know how compensation works. Emily nodded. But these two corrections were calibrated under different transient assumptions. A senior engineer stepped closer. That shouldn't matter. It doesn't. Emily paused. Until both happen inside the same 400 millisecond window. The room grew quieter. She returned to the engine and removed a protective cover from the compensation manifold. Her movements were economical, almost unnervingly certain. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Richard noticed. So did Marcus. Emily disconnected one lead, inspected it, then reattached it. Richard frowned. You're not replacing the sensor. It isn't broken. Then replace the controller. That isn't broken either. Richard gave a humorless laugh. So nothing is broken, yet my engine doesn't run. Emily looked up. That's what everyone keeps getting wrong. She stood. The components work. Her eyes moved across the senior engineering team. The logic works. Then she pointed toward the HMX-9. But together, under this exact condition, they create a conflict neither system was designed to recognize. Marcus slowly turned toward the diagnostic display. His face changed. Feedback convergence. Emily nodded. Delayed convergence. One engineer shook his head. We simulated that. You simulated steady-state convergence. Emily opened another record. This happens during transition. The engineer stopped speaking. Richard's jaw tightened. He had personally approved the final architecture after months of delays. If Emily was right, the problem was not a defective $10 sensor. It was buried inside the design itself. That configuration passed validation, Richard said. Emily met his gaze. Then validation missed it. You're telling me my entire engineering division missed a design flaw? No. Her voice remained calm. I'm telling you they were looking for a failed part because everyone assumed the architecture was already proven. That silence was different. Nobody smiled now. Richard stepped closer. And your solution? Emily adjusted one parameter, then another. Change the priority window. Prevent simultaneous correction during the transient state, then recalibrate the compensation threshold. Marcus stared at the values. That could work. It will. Richard heard the certainty. He disliked it. You seem very confident for someone who hasn't started the engine. Emily finished the adjustment. Then she stepped away from the controls. Don't believe me. Richard froze. Emily looked through the glass at the machine that had defeated his best engineers for 6 hours. Start it. Nobody moved. Minutes earlier, Richard had been willing to restart the HMX-9 repeatedly despite Emily's warning. Now his hand remained at his side. The irony was not lost on anyone. Marcus looked at him. Well? Richard's eyes hardened. He reached toward the ignition control. Emily stopped him. One more thing. Richard turned. If I'm wrong, shut it down immediately. And if you're right? Emily glanced at the engineers surrounding them. There was no triumph in her expression. Only certainty. If I'm right, listen carefully. To what? Emily looked back at the engine. The sound it was supposed to make all along. Richard pressed the ignition. The starter engaged. Every person in the room stopped breathing. For one terrible second, nothing happened. The starter spun. A low mechanical whine filled the chamber, and Richard Hale's hand hovered above the emergency shutdown switch. Then the HMX-9 ignited. The sound struck the room like thunder. Emily Carter did not smile. Watch the thermal curve. Marcus Reed turned toward the monitor. Temperature climbed. Pressure followed. The engine settled into idle, smooth but cautious, as if waking from a long sleep. Richard stared through the reinforced glass. Bring it to 25% load. Marcus hesitated. Emily nodded. Do it. The technician increased the load. The HMX-9 responded instantly. No vibration spike. No warning. No shutdown. Ethan Miller leaned toward the screen. Pressure correction is holding. Thermal compensation. Marcus asked. Stable. Richard said nothing. 40%, Emily said. The engine deepened into a powerful growl. Numbers streamed across the diagnostic monitors. Green. 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 Every parameter that had flashed red less than an hour earlier now remained inside tolerance. One senior engineer stepped closer. That's impossible. Emily heard him. Her eyes never left the data. No. It was predictable. 50%. The floor trembled beneath their shoes. Richard watched the output climb past the point where every previous test had failed. He waited for the warning light. Nothing. 60%. Marcus stared at the vibration graph. The secondary oscillation was gone. Not reduced. Gone. Emily. She looked at him. Marcus pointed at the screen. You eliminated it. Emily shook her head. I didn't eliminate anything. She pointed toward the compensation trace. I stopped the systems from fighting each other. Richard finally stepped toward the monitor. Take it to 75. Marcus turned sharply. We should stabilize first. 75. Emily studied the readings. Then nodded. The technician increased the load. The HMX-9 roared. A coffee cup vibrated across a nearby workbench. The reinforced glass hummed softly. Every face in the control room reflected the green glow of the monitors. 70%. 72. 75. Stable. Ethan whispered, "Oh my God." Then the output number climbed again. Marcus blinked. That can't be right. Richard looked at him. What? We're above the previous benchmark. By how much? Marcus checked twice. 4.8%. Nobody spoke. Emily finally exhaled. Richard slowly turned toward her. 20 minutes earlier, he had invited senior engineers and executives downstairs because he wanted witnesses to her embarrassment. Now those same witnesses stood around him in complete silence. The only sound was the engine. Strong. Controlled. Alive. Richard looked at the wrench still resting beside Emily's workstation. She had barely used it. 6 hours of troubleshooting. Multiple replacement components. 3 failed restarts. And the quiet 25-year-old assistant had solved the problem by refusing to assume something had to be broken. Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Marcus looked at Emily differently now. Not with surprise. With recognition. Something about her explanation bothered him. Not because it was wrong. Because it was familiar. Where did you learn to analyze transient convergence like that? He asked. Emily's expression changed. Marcus. No. He moved toward another terminal. I've seen this methodology before. Emily became still. Marcus searched the engineering archive. Richard watched him. What are you doing? Marcus ignored the question. A technical paper appeared on the monitor. He stared at the author line. Then at Emily. His face lost its color. Emily, he said quietly. The engine continued roaring behind the glass. What is your full name? Emily did not answer. Marcus looked back at the paper. Then he whispered the name printed beneath its title. Emily Carter. Richard frowned. So. Marcus slowly turned toward him. The room went silent again. But this time, it had nothing to do with the engine. You challenged the woman whose research helped make this architecture possible. Richard Hale stared at Marcus Reed as though he had spoken in another language. What do you mean, her research? Marcus turned the monitor toward him. An engineering paper filled the screen, dense with equations, thermal models, and transient response diagrams. Richard ignored all of it. His eyes found the author's name. Emily Carter. He looked at the 25-year-old woman standing beside him. Then back at the screen. That could be anyone. It isn't. Marcus opened another file. Then another. Emily lowered her eyes. Marcus, please. But the room had already changed. The woman nobody had noticed 3 weeks earlier was suddenly the only person anyone could see. Marcus read silently for several seconds. Adaptive transient compensation in high-output combustion systems, he said. Published 4 years ago. One senior engineer stepped closer. I remember that paper. So do I, another said. Richard's face tightened. Marcus continued. The control principle we adapted for the HMX-9 traces back to this research. Richard looked at Emily. You wrote this? Emily hesitated. Yes. The answer was almost too quiet to hear. Ethan stared at her. You were 21. Emily gave him a small nod. Nobody laughed now. Richard stepped closer to the monitor. If you knew this architecture, why didn't you tell anyone? Emily's expression remained calm. I asked questions. That's not what I asked. No. Her eyes met his. You're asking why I didn't walk into this building and announce who I used to be. Used to be. Marcus caught the phrase. What happened? Emily was silent for a moment. The HMX-9 continued running behind the glass, its steady rhythm filling the space between them. I worked with an advanced propulsion research group after college, she finally said. I was good at the technical work. Richard glanced at the papers. That seems like an understatement. Emily ignored him. But being good didn't make the environment good. She explained without bitterness. Her work had become surrounded by competition, credit disputes, conferences, and people more interested in names attached to discoveries than the discoveries themselves. After a project collapsed under internal politics, Emily walked away. She wanted to remember why she loved machines. Not why people fought over them. So you became a diagnostic assistant? Ethan asked. I wanted to work somewhere I could listen again. Richard looked around the room. The irony landed slowly. She had come to Hale Performance Motors seeking quiet work. And he had dragged executives downstairs to publicly demonstrate that she did not belong. Marcus scrolled farther through the paper. Then he stopped. Richard. Something in his voice changed. What? Marcus pointed toward a diagram. The original model includes a transition safeguard. Richard stepped closer. The HMX-9 implementation displayed beside it did not. Marcus opened the company's adaptation history. Several engineers gathered around. Emily already knew what they would find. During development, the safeguard had been simplified to improve response time. The revision carried an executive approval. Richard Hale. His eyes settled on his own digital signature. No one needed to explain it. Richard had approved the shortcut that created the weakness Emily had just corrected. He slowly looked at her. Emily could have smiled. She could have reminded everyone how he had mocked her. She could have made him feel exactly as small as he had tried to make her feel. She did none of those things. The decision made sense with the data you had, she said. Richard seemed almost confused by her mercy. You're defending me? No. Emily looked toward the engine. I'm saying engineering isn't about finding someone to blame. Then she met his eyes. It's about being willing to see what you missed. Behind them, the HMX-9 continued its flawless run. And for the first time that morning, Richard Hale had nothing to say. The next afternoon, the HMX-9 stood beneath a different kind of light. Executives, investors, engineers, and representatives from the company's largest prospective client filled the demonstration hall. Cameras faced the reinforced testing chamber. A massive screen displayed live performance data above the stage. And near the back of the room stood Emily Carter. Plain navy jacket. Faded jeans. Blonde hair tied back. Almost exactly as she had looked when Richard Hale laughed at her. Only now, nobody was laughing. Richard approached the microphone. Yesterday, we experienced a technical problem that threatened today's demonstration. Emily watched silently. She knew what could happen next. Richard could call it a team effort. He could describe the solution without mentioning her name. He could accept the applause. Nobody outside the engineering team would ever know. Richard looked toward the board members seated in the front row. Then toward Marcus Reed. Finally, he found Emily. For several seconds, he said nothing. The HMX-9 is operating today because someone in this company saw what the rest of us missed. The room became still. Richard stepped away from the microphone. Emily Carter, would you come up here? A murmur spread through the audience. Emily froze. Ethan smiled from beside the test controls. Go. Emily walked forward. Her footsteps sounded strangely loud against the polished floor. Richard waited until she reached him. Then he handed her the microphone. Not a wrench. A microphone. The person who should explain why this engine is running, Richard said, isn't me. Emily looked at him. There was something different in his face. Not humiliation. Humility. She turned toward the audience. Yesterday, the engine didn't fail because one component was defective, she began. It failed because two systems were doing exactly what they were designed to do. The screen behind her displayed the conflicting signals. Emily explained the problem simply. No performance. No attempt to impress. Within minutes, executives who had never studied engineering understood how two correct signals could produce one disastrous result. Then Richard interrupted. There's something else they should know. Emily turned. Richard faced the audience. I dismissed her before I understood what she knew. A hush fell. I judged her position before I listened to her reasoning. And when she challenged my assumption, I tried to embarrass her publicly. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Richard continued. That was not leadership. Emily could have let the silence punish him. Instead, she stepped toward the microphone. The engineering team spent months building this machine, she said. I found one problem because their work gave me enough information to see it. Marcus lowered his head with a quiet smile. Emily looked across the room. Machines don't care about titles. They don't care who has the largest office or the most impressive degree. A few people smiled. They respond to what is true. She paused. People deserve at least that much fairness too. Behind her, the HMX-9 started. Its roar filled the demonstration hall. The performance numbers climbed. Every indicator remained green. This time, applause came before the engine stopped. Emily stepped away from the microphone. Richard offered his hand. She looked at it for a moment. Then shook it. Months later, Hale Performance Motors would establish a new advanced systems group, with Emily helping lead its technical research. Ethan joined the team. Marcus remained one of her closest collaborators. But the most important change could not be measured in horsepower. People started listening differently. Junior technicians spoke during engineering meetings. Assistants were invited to challenge assumptions. And Richard Hale developed one habit that surprised everyone who knew him. When the quietest person in the room raised a hand, he stopped talking. Because sometimes brilliance does not arrive wearing a prestigious title. Sometimes it stands quietly in the corner until someone finally has the humility to listen. And that day, everyone at Hale Performance Motors remembered what respect looked like.